Okay, we can start on the interface at last, I hear some of you say. And actually it's lovely to get into the interface style, because it does mean actually we've reached a bit of a milestone in that we've created all of our logic for our application, and we can just now enjoy making it work. So let me just remind you of what we're going to be looking to achieve. I've got a screenshot of the build application in full, which is there, and that's where we've got a forename, a surname, a string, which will give the application all the data it needs to do this jobs it's got to do. So that's what we're aiming for. And we're going to write this in XAML. And we're going to use our XAML, and we're going to reference our styles, because that's what we've said we would do. And in our XAML, we're going to use our page that we've created called PageDetails, and that's where these things are going to go. Now this is the way I like to work. It's not essential, because you can split the screen in opposite directions, but lots of people work that way. I don't like it, but that's just me. You do whatever suits you best. You can actually hide bits of the screen if you just wanted to focus in on all of that, and so forth, but there's lots of things that you can do to adjust the interface for yourself. What is useful is that on the left hand side, if you've got your GUI here, that you do fit all. That does give you a sense that things are being created when you write the code here in the right hand panel. That's not essential either, because you can just do it and it should work. But I would just want to remind you of something that I said a good long while ago, is that we can use our snap fits in here, but we don't. You know, we can actually just drag controls in here, and we don't. We're going to make all of our controls in code. I just want to remind you of what happens with WPF. WPF is using containers. We're talking about a page container here. That's a page, and inside our page we've got a grid, and our pages come with a grid, so we don't actually have to do anything. And what we do is we take a kind of onion skin approach, and things are inside things. And for example, in our grid, the first thing we're going to add is a thing called a stack panel, which allows things to be orientated horizontally and vertically and so forth, in our case vertically. And so it's kind of a series of steps that we do to control things. And from that point of view, it's a slightly different way of thinking about the design that you have to create. And our grid is going to contain elements. And of course, the first thing we want to do is put rows and columns into our grid, because we want this to appear in a row, this to appear in a row, this, and then these in two columns, so that they're neatly separated in the user interface. So you can see that it's maybe a slightly different way of thinking about things, and it's perhaps a little bit different from you maybe experiencing in your other types of development that you've done. I want to remind you of another thing that I said a long time ago. Remember I said that I was developing mine in .NET Core, and I said, I found a bug, and this is the bug that I found. What it is that it says that I've got an error in my static resources, my styles, but I haven't, and when I run it they work fine. But you might see when I'm making my code to show you that you're seeing this blue wavy underline and it says resource not found, when in fact it is. It's there, it can use it, it displays things correctly. So please just ignore this if you see it in my videos, and you shouldn't see it in yours, because remember I said don't use .NET Core, use .NET Framework, and if you've done that then these won't appear. So that's just something that we need to be aware of as we move forward. Right, in my design I decided that I needed 6 rows for my my control containers. So I add these into my grid, but before I do, my grid at the moment butts right up against the edge of this, and I don't want that. I want to just put a little bit of styling in here. And what I do there is before the chevron, before the greater than sign, I put margin equals, and it will give me the quotes, and then I just give it a numeric value for the margin I want to put around this whole page, the grid that controls everything that's inside it. And you'll see when I do the number, it will put this edge and push it inwards, or actually just put a margin around everything, so that it just not quite button up to the edge, and that's really good styling. So when I put the number 5, you see that the page says, oh, it needs to have a margin around everything. So regardless of what space I've given it here in terms of size, it's going to be 5 all round, reserved for a margin. So that's what I've done there, and that's a nice bit of styling to use for an application. So when I want to add my rows, I do this for the opening tag dot row definitions, and you'll see I'm getting IntelliSense, which is brilliant for helping me to think about what can you do with a grid. Press tab, then put the closing tag, and I get the structure automatically. So I can now add my row definitions. And you can just close this one. You don't have to put the full tags in so that you can put things in between it, because it doesn't need anything. One of the great beauties of what we do in WPF is that I can now just take that, Control C to copy it, Control V, 6. I've now got my 6 rows that I need, and I just have to tidy up where the copying was done, and that's my 6 rows, and that's really cool in WPF is what you can do. So let me add now my column definitions. And this time I do want to make space between the tags, openers and closers, but I don't need to do it again for this. So column definition, and it starts to understand what you wanted to do, and it's really, the IntelliSense in this is getting better and stronger all the time. So I now have my page structure. There it is. Now this isn't quite how I want it to look, because I don't want these all to be of equal height. I want them to have heights which are relative to each other. And at the moment, the way this is notated, we would say that they all have 1 star value each. Okay, so that's how we may modify the height of the controls that we're going to, or the row controls that we've got here. So for example, in my first row, which by the way is index reference 0, I can now put height, tab, and it gives me the closers, and I'm going to put 2 star asterisk. Do you see what happened there? That got more space on the page than the other rows. It got double the amount of everything else, and it's all relative. I don't have to work it out. It just says, oh, relative to this 1 star standard, how many star standards does this want to go? So this is like a proportional system on the page. So I'm going to say that the next one, and I'll just put these in so you don't have to watch me. So I've now added all of the relative heights. So in total, I've said that this page is divided up into 3 plus 2, 6, 7, 8, 10 effective height values. And I'm saying of those 10, I'm going to give the top one 2. These get 1 each, this gets 2, and that one gets 3. Now we don't have to do anything with the columns at all, because they've got to be of equal width. We don't want to have any differentiation. Sometimes you might, and in fact it's quite common to have a label with a wider content area than the content value that you're going to put a text box in, where a small number has to be entered and so forth. So that's our first stage. We've made our grid, and we've made our grid columns. We've used relative heights, and that's really good. Now that's great. We've got our row definitions, we've got our column definitions, and we've got this structure here. But I want to add something. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut these values out in just a moment, the row and columns, because I want to put another container in called a stack panel. And what a stack panel will allow you to do, and it's not necessary here, but I want you to show you this idea of containers inside containers, is that this stack panel allows us to arrange that the flow is vertical or horizontal. And it's a very powerful control. It's a very powerful container, that we can use to make sure that things go in the direction that we do. And I will overuse it in this particular example of a development. We don't have to do it the way I do it, but I over-engineering it so that you can get an understanding of what's going to happen. So just after the grid closing part there, I'm going to put stack panel, and I definitely want to have space in between the opening and closing tags, and I'm just going to move my grid inside the stack panel. Yeah, now it hasn't done anything at all to our grid. It's still the same grid, but I'm getting this problem because I've lost the grid. My grid is now outside of there. So at last it said, oh gosh, your markup's wrong. It took a minute or two to catch up. So what I need to do is inside this stack panel, I need to put a grid. And if I now move my rows and column definitions inside that grid, they now belong to a grid, and everything should be fine. Now we're not seeing anything again now. We've lost the controls here because we haven't actually added any controls into our main grid. They've been nested in here, but as we create our controls, we will start to see them appear inside this stack panel control, which has its own grid. So it's quite a lot to take in. We do a lot of nesting of structure, and it means that you can create a very complicated layout by using this nested structure, and not everything has to be the same size, not of the same height or width, so you can end up with a very complicated grid structure if you engineer it correctly. And it almost comes down to engineering, where you're making sure that everything is the place that it needs to be. Another reason why I like to draw pretty pictures before I start to develop, because it gives me a really strong notion about how I need to create the structure when I need to create it. Right, so we've now got our structure, so in the next video what we'll do is we'll start to put our controls in.